The harsh winter wind cut across the plains of Oklahoma Territory like a knife, but the pain in Margaret Evans' heart was sharper still as she gazed down at her week-old twin boys, their tiny faces peaceful in sleep, unaware they'd entered a world without a father. The small cabin outside Muskogee creaked under the relentless December gusts of 1878, and Margaret wondered how much longer she could hold on before the cold or despair claimed them all. Margaret tucked the thin blanket more securely around Timothy and Thomas, her precious boys born just 7 days earlier with only the midwife's assistance. The midwife had left 2 days ago, promising to send help, but no one had come. Her husband Daniel had been dead 3 months now, shot by cattle rustlers while defending their small herd, all that stood between them and starvation in this unforgiving frontier. She moved to add wood to the dwindling fire, her body still weak from childbirth. The larder was nearly empty, the woodpile shrinking faster than she'd calculated, and the nearest neighbor was 5 miles away, an impossible journey through snow with newborns. As darkness fell and the temperature dropped further, Margaret felt tears slide down her cheeks. She'd been strong for so long, but tonight she felt the crushing weight of her situation. "Daniel," she whispered to the empty room, "I don't know how to do this without you." One of the twins, Thomas, with the birthmark on his left shoulder, stirred and began to cry. Margaret lifted him gently, cradling him to her breast. "Hush, my love," she soothed, though her own heart felt anything but calm. As Thomas quieted and Timothy began to fuss, she wondered how long she could keep switching between them, feeding them, keeping them warm enough to survive. The howl of wolves in the distance made her shiver. In the 3 years she and Daniel had homesteaded this land, she'd grown accustomed to the sounds of the frontier, but now every noise seemed a threat to her babies. A different sound caught her attention, the steady rhythm of hoofbeats approaching. Fear and hope warred within her. Friend or foe? Salvation or further danger? Margaret laid Thomas beside his brother and moved to the window, peering through frost-covered glass. A tall figure on horseback emerged from the swirling snow, leading a second horse loaded with supplies. The rider dismounted and approached the cabin. Margaret grabbed Daniel's old rifle from above the door, though in her weakened state, she doubted she could aim it properly. 3 sharp knocks rattled the door. "Who's there?" Margaret called, her voice stronger than she felt. "Name's Yates Jackson, madam. Mrs. Holloway, the midwife, sent me. Said there's a new mother out here with twins who needs assistance." Margaret hesitated, still clutching the rifle. "How do I know you're telling the truth?" A deep, tired sigh came from the other side of the door. "Mrs. Holloway said to tell you that Timothy has a dimple on his right cheek, and Thomas has a birthmark shaped like a leaf on his shoulder. I've brought supplies, food, firewood, medicine. But I'll leave them on the porch if you prefer not to open the door." Margaret lowered the rifle with shaking hands and unbarred the door. The cold wind rushed in along with a tall man covered in snow. He swept off his hat immediately, revealing tousled dark hair and concerned blue eyes in a weather-bronzed face. "Thank you for coming," Margaret said, suddenly conscious of her disheveled appearance and the meager state of her home. Yates Jackson nodded, taking in the situation with a quick glance: the low fire, the nearly empty wood box, the twins swaddled together for warmth, and the pale, exhausted woman before him. Without another word, he turned and went back outside. Before Margaret could wonder if he was leaving, he returned with armfuls of firewood, which he stacked neatly by the hearth before building up the fire. "I'll bring in the rest of the supplies," he said, his voice gentle but firm. "You should sit, Mrs. Evans." "Margaret Evans," she supplied, sinking gratefully into a chair by the twins' cradle. For the next hour, Yates worked silently and efficiently, bringing in provisions, filling the woodbox, hauling water from the well, and even tending to his horses in the small stable behind the cabin. When he finally returned inside, stamping snow from his boots, the cabin was warmer than it had been in days. He removed his heavy coat and set about unpacking the food supplies he'd brought: flour, beans, salt pork, coffee, sugar, dried fruits, and even a jar of preserved peaches. He moved with the practiced ease of a man accustomed to fending for himself. "Mrs. Holloway was mighty worried about you and these little ones," he said at last, glancing at the twins. "She'd have come back herself, but her sister took ill in town. Asked if I'd check on you since my ranch is nearest." Margaret nodded, realizing she'd heard of the Jackson Ranch, a successful operation about 10 miles east. "I'm grateful, Mr. Jackson, but I wouldn't want to impose—" "No imposition, madam." His voice was quiet but firm. "Folks help each other out here. It's how we all survive." He paused, seeming to choose his words carefully. "Mrs. Holloway mentioned your situation, about your husband." Margaret's throat tightened. "3 months ago, rustlers." Yates nodded solemnly. "I'm sorry for your loss, Mrs. Evans." One of the twins began to cry, and Margaret moved to pick him up. Yates turned away to give her privacy as she adjusted her blouse to feed the hungry infant. "I'll fix us some supper while you tend to the little one," he said, already moving toward the stove with confidence. Margaret wanted to protest, to say she could manage, but exhaustion and hunger overwhelmed her pride. "Thank you," she whispered, not sure if he could hear her over the baby's hungry sounds and the crackling fire. As darkness fell completely outside, the cabin transformed. The fire blazed cheerfully. A pot of bean stew simmered on the stove, filling the air with a hearty aroma, and fresh coffee perked in the pot. Margaret had finished nursing both twins and now sat at the table, watching in bewilderment as this stranger moved about her kitchen with easy competence. "How long has it been since you've had a proper meal, Mrs. Evans?" Yates asked, setting a steaming bowl before her. Margaret considered lying but found she lacked the energy. "I've had tea and bread. The babies need my strength more than I do." A frown crossed his weathered features. "That won't do. Those boys need a healthy mother." He filled a cup with coffee and added a generous spoonful of sugar. "Drink this, eat your stew, and then get some rest. I'll keep watch tonight." "You can't stay," Margaret protested weakly. "It wouldn't be proper." A hint of amusement flickered in his eyes. "I'll sleep in the chair by the fire, madam. Nothing improper about that. Besides, this storm's not letting up before morning." Too tired to argue further, Margaret ate the simple but delicious stew, feeling strength return to her limbs with each spoonful. When she'd finished, Yates took the bowl without comment and brought her more coffee. "Thank you," she said, meeting his gaze directly for the first time. "I don't know what would have happened if—" "No need to think about that now," he interrupted gently. "Get some rest, Mrs. Evans. Tomorrow we'll figure out what needs doing." Margaret retreated to her bed, positioned near enough to the twins' cradle that she could reach them easily. Despite her intention to remain vigilant, the combination of warmth, a full stomach, and the reassuring presence of another adult in the house soon lulled her into the deepest sleep she'd had since the twins' birth. She woke to bright sunlight streaming through the windows and the smell of frying bacon. For a disorienting moment, she thought Daniel had returned, that the past 3 months had been a terrible dream. Reality crashed back as she saw the twins, now awake and making soft cooing sounds, and heard the unfamiliar deeper voice speaking softly to them. Raising herself on one elbow, Margaret saw Yates Jackson kneeling beside the cradle, one large finger gently clasped in tiny Timothy's fist. "Your mama's the bravest lady I've ever met," he was saying to the babies in a low, gentle tone. "And you boys are going to grow up strong and fine, just like her." Something in Margaret's chest tightened at the tenderness in this rough cowboy's manner. She cleared her throat and he stood immediately, a hint of color touching his tanned cheeks. "Morning, Mrs. Evans. Hope I didn't wake you. These little fellows were stirring and I thought I'd let you sleep a bit longer." "Thank you," she said, suddenly conscious of her rumpled appearance. "I haven't slept so well in weeks." Yates nodded and returned to the stove. "Breakfast is nearly ready. Storm's passed, but it's left quite a blanket of snow. I've already fed and watered the livestock." Margaret blinked in surprise. She'd forgotten about the 2 chickens and the milk cow Daniel had bought just before his death, the animals she'd been too weak to properly tend. "You didn't have to do that." "No trouble," he replied, setting plates on the table. "The cow's giving good milk despite the cold. That'll be good for you and indirectly for the little ones." As Margaret fed and changed the twins, Yates moved about the cabin, making small repairs she hadn't had the strength or skills to address: a loose floorboard, a draft around the window, a leak in the roof corner. By midday, the cabin felt more secure than it had in months. Over a lunch of leftover stew, Yates finally broached the subject Margaret had been dreading. "Mrs. Evans, I don't mean to pry into your affairs, but what are your plans? Winter's just starting, and it's going to be a hard one by all signs." Margaret stared into her bowl, pride warring with practicality. "We'll manage," she said, though her voice lacked conviction. Yates leaned forward, his expression earnest. "Forgive my bluntness, madam, but no, you won't. Not alone, not with 2 newborns and not with limited supplies. The nearest town is 20 miles away. Your closest neighbor is the Hendersons 5 miles south, and they're elderly themselves." Tears stung Margaret's eyes. "What would you have me do? Abandon the home my husband and I built? The land he died protecting?" "Never," Yates said firmly, "but there are other options." "Such as?" Margaret challenged, anger momentarily overcoming her gratitude. "I have a proposition," Yates said carefully. "My ranch is well-established, good house, solid barn, 4 ranch hands who live in the bunkhouse. I've got plenty of space, plenty of food, and could use someone to keep house." Margaret stiffened. "I'm not looking for charity, Mr. Jackson. And I'm not offering any," he replied evenly. "I'm proposing a practical arrangement. You and the twins come stay at the ranch for the winter. You cook for me and the hands, keep the house in order as your strength returns. In exchange, you have a safe, warm place for your boys to grow, good food and protection. Come spring, if you want to return here, I'll personally help you get this place back in working order." Margaret frowned, considering his words. "And if I refuse?" Yates met her gaze steadily. "Then I'll respect your decision, bring you regular supplies when I can, and pray for your safety every night. But I won't lie to you, Mrs. Evans. Your chances out here alone aren't good, and those boys deserve better odds than that." The truth of his words stung, but Margaret couldn't deny them. She looked at her sleeping sons, so tiny and vulnerable. What would Daniel want her to do? Stay and risk their lives for pride's sake, or accept help to ensure their survival? "I need time to think," she said finally. "Of course," Yates replied, standing to clear the dishes. "I'll finish the repairs I can make today. The offer stands, regardless of your decision." Throughout the afternoon, Margaret watched Yates work tirelessly around her small homestead. He chopped more wood, mucked out the stable, checked the cabin's roof, and even repaired a broken wagon wheel Daniel had left leaning against the barn. All without complaint, without seeking praise, without making her feel indebted. As the short winter day began to darken, Margaret made her decision. Looking at the twins, at their perfect faces and tiny hands, she knew what mattered most. "We'll come," she told Yates as he came in from his final check on the horses. "Until spring, as you said. but I insist on contributing my fair share of work and will return here once the weather breaks." Relief washed across Yates's face, though he tried to hide it behind a businesslike nod. "That's sensible, Mrs. Evans. We can leave tomorrow morning if that suits. I've brought a special wagon with a covered bed. We'll make it comfortable for you and the little ones." That night, as Margaret packed what few belongings she couldn't bear to leave behind Daniel's pocket watch, their wedding photograph, the family Bible with the twins' births newly recorded, she wondered if she was making the right choice. Yet as she glanced at the sleeping forms of Timothy and Thomas, she knew the answer. Their lives outweighed all other considerations. Morning brought clear skies and biting cold. Yates had transformed the wagon bed into a snug nest of blankets and hay, with hot bricks wrapped in flannel to keep the space warm. Margaret marveled at his thoughtfulness as he carefully helped her and the twins into the protected space. "It's not the most elegant transportation," he apologized, "but it'll keep you warm for the journey." Margaret settled against the padded backrest, a twin cradled in each arm. "It's perfect, Mr. Jackson, thank you." Yates secured the homestead as best he could, making sure the livestock had enough feed and water to last, until he could send one of his hands to check on them. Then, with one final look at the cabin, he climbed onto the wagon seat and set the horses in motion. As they pulled away from the only home her sons had known, Margaret felt a strange mixture of sorrow and hope. She wasn't abandoning this place, she reminded herself, just seeking shelter until she could return stronger. The journey to the Jackson ranch took most of the day, with Yates stopping frequently to check on Margaret and the twins, offering water, jerky, and dried fruit to keep up her strength. Despite the cold, the weather remained clear and Margaret found herself admiring the stark beauty of the snow-covered prairie. "Just over that rise," Yates said in the late afternoon, pointing ahead. "You'll see the ranch soon." When they crested the hill, Margaret couldn't help a small gasp of surprise. The Jackson ranch was far more substantial than she'd imagined, a large two-story house built of sturdy logs with glass windows, a massive barn, several outbuildings, a bunkhouse, and corrals containing dozens of horses. Smoke rose invitingly from the main house's chimney. "You didn't mention it was such a large operation," Margaret said, feeling suddenly intimidated. Yates shrugged slightly. "Started small like everyone, been lucky these past few years." He guided the wagon toward the house. "My father began it, left it to me when he passed 5 years back. Been expanding since then." As they approached, a gray-haired woman emerged from the house, followed by a younger man in ranch clothes. Yates halted the wagon and jumped down. "Mrs. Evans, this is Mrs. Garrett, my housekeeper, and Jim Perkins, my foreman." Yates introduced them as he helped Margaret from the wagon. "Mrs. Garrett, Jim, this is Mrs. Margaret Evans and her sons Timothy and Thomas. They'll be staying with us through the winter." Mrs. Garrett stepped forward immediately, her weathered face breaking into a warm smile. "Land's sakes, you poor dear, out in this cold with newborns. Come inside this instant. I've got a fire going and stew on the stove." Yates carefully lifted the twins from the wagon and handed one to Margaret while carrying the other himself. "I've had the east bedroom prepared. It gets the morning sun and stays warmest. Mrs. Garrett will show you everything you need." The interior of the house was even more impressive than its exterior, polished wooden floors covered with colorful rugs, solid furniture, a massive stone fireplace, and actual paintings on the walls. Margaret felt suddenly shabby in her worn dress, but Mrs. Garrett's motherly fussing left no room for embarrassment. "Mr. Jackson told me about your situation, dear," the older woman said as she led Margaret upstairs. "Such a tragedy, but you're safe now. He's had me airing out this room for days, ever since Mrs. Holloway told him about you." Margaret paused on the landing. "Days. But he only came to my cabin yesterday." Mrs. Garrett looked momentarily flustered. "Well, I suppose he was planning to check on you regardless, once he heard there was a widow with newborns out there alone. That's the kind of man Mr. Jackson is always looking out for those in need." The east bedroom was larger than Margaret's entire cabin, with a 4-poster bed, a rocking chair by the window, and most surprising of all, a handcrafted cradle large enough for both twins. "Mr. Jackson made that himself," Mrs. Garrett said, noticing Margaret's gaze. "Been working on it evenings since he heard about your situation. Said twins should be able to sleep together since that's what they're used to." Tears sprang to Margaret's eyes as she gently laid Thomas in the cradle beside Timothy, whom Yates had carried up. The craftsmanship was exquisite, smooth wood polish to a soft glow, sturdy rockers, even small carvings of stars and moons along the sides. "He made this for my sons," Margaret whispered. Mrs. Garrett nodded. "That's the kind of man he is, Mrs. Evans. Heart as big as the territory itself, though he'd die before admitting it." That evening, after the twins were fed and settled in their new cradle, Margaret joined Yates and Mrs. Garrett for dinner. The ranch hands ate in the bunkhouse, giving Margaret time to adjust to her new surroundings without too many unfamiliar faces. "I want to thank you again for your generosity, Mr. Jackson," Margaret said as Mrs. Garrett served a hearty beef stew. "I promise I'll earn my keep." Yates waved off her thanks. "No rush on that, Mrs. Evans. You need time to regain your strength and care for your boys. Mrs. Garrett has been managing fine on her own, but she's getting on in years and could use the help once you're ready." The older woman snorted. "Getting on in years, indeed. I'm 63, not 103. But her tone was affectionate as she swatted Yates's shoulder. "Though I won't deny an extra pair of hands will be welcome, especially with these men tracking mud everywhere I look." Margaret found herself smiling for what felt like the first time in months. There was something comforting about the easy rapport between Yates and his housekeeper, like family, rather than employer and employee. After dinner, Yates excused himself to check on the ranch hands and the evening chores, leaving Margaret with Mrs. Garrett. The older woman showed Margaret around the kitchen and pantry, impressing her with the well-stocked shelves. "Mr. Jackson makes sure we never want for anything, Mrs. Garrett explained. Says a well-fed ranch is a happy ranch. He's right, too, never had hands so loyal. Some have been with him since his father's time." "How long have you been here?" Margaret asked, helping to wash the dishes despite Mrs. Garrett's protests. 12 years now. Came after my husband passed. Mr. Jackson's father hired me, and I stayed on after the young Mr. Jackson inherited." She dried a plate with careful movements. "He was just 23 then, full of grand ideas for expanding. Most thought he'd fail, but look at all this now, one of the most prosperous ranches in the territory." "He seems very capable," Margaret observed neutrally. Mrs. Garrett's eyes twinkled. "Capable, kind, and not bad to look at either, though don't tell him I said so. Too modest by half, that man, and too busy working to court properly. More's the pity." Margaret felt her cheeks warm. "Mrs. Garrett, I've only just lost my husband. I'm not looking for—" "Of course not, dear," the older woman interrupted. "I wasn't suggesting anything of the sort. Just making conversation, that's all." But her knowing smile suggested otherwise. That night, in the comfort of a real bed with her sons sleeping peacefully nearby, Margaret reflected on the dramatic change in their circumstances in just 2 days. From the brink of disaster to this unexpected sanctuary. She still grieved for Daniel, still missed him with an ache that seemed physical, but for the first time since his death, she felt a flicker of hope for the future. The next weeks passed in a gentle rhythm as Margaret adjusted to life at the Jackson ranch. True to his word, Yates didn't pressure her to begin household duties immediately, insisting she focus on regaining her strength and caring for the twins. Mrs. Garrett became like a mother to Margaret, offering advice on the babies and quiet companionship during long winter afternoons. The ranch hands 4 weathered men ranging in age from 25 to nearly 50 treated Margaret with respectful distance at first, but soon warmed to her presence, especially after she began helping with meals. Jim Perkins, the foreman, was the first to compliment her cooking directly. "Begging your pardon, Mrs. Evans, but these are the best biscuits I've had since my mother's," he declared one evening when Margaret had insisted on preparing dinner to give Mrs. Garrett a rest. "High praise indeed," Yates remarked with a rare smile. Jim's mother was renowned for her biscuits throughout 3 counties. Margaret found herself blushing under the approval. "My grandmother's recipe. She claimed the secret was in how you handle the dough with respect but not fear." The men laughed appreciatively, and Margaret realized how much she'd missed simple human interaction beyond the confines of her isolated cabin. As December gave way to January, the twins thrived in the warm, secure environment. They gained weight steadily, began to show distinct personalities, Timothy more vocal and demanding, Thomas quieter but more observant, and even slept for longer stretches at night, giving Margaret much-needed rest. Yates, for his part, maintained a respectful distance while ensuring Margaret and the twins wanted for nothing. He spent most days working the ranch despite the winter weather, often returning after dark covered in snow and exhaustion. Yet he always made time to ask after the twins, sometimes bringing small gifts, a soft rabbit pelt for their cradle, hand-carved wooden toys for when they were older. One evening in late January, Margaret found him in his study, poring over ranch accounts with a furrowed brow. She hesitated in the doorway, a cup of coffee in her hand. "Mr. Jackson, I thought you might like this. You missed dinner." Yates looked up, surprise and pleasure crossing his features. "Mrs. Evans, thank you. Lost track of time, I'm afraid." He accepted the cup gratefully. "How are the boys this evening?" "Growing stronger every day," she replied, lingering in the doorway. "Mrs. Garrett is sitting with them so I could stretch my legs a bit." Yates gestured to a chair. "Please join me if you'd like. I could use a break from these figures." Margaret hesitated only briefly before sitting. The study was a comfortable room lined with bookshelves, something that had surprised her about this cowboy. Yates Jackson was clearly educated, though he never made a show of it. "Is everything all right with the ranch?" she asked, noticing his concerned expression. He sighed, rubbing his temple. "Just planning for spring. We'll need to increase the herd if we're to meet the contracts I've signed with the railroad." "That sounds like good news, not something to worry about." Yates smiled slightly. "It is good news, but it means more hands to hire, more grazing land to secure, more of everything." He paused, studying her. "Forgive me, this must be terribly dull for you." "Not at all," Margaret replied honestly. "My father was a banker in St. Louis. I grew up listening to financial discussions." Interest sparked in Yates's eyes. "St. Louis, that's quite a journey to Muskogee territory." Margaret nodded, a distant look crossing her face. "I met Daniel, my husband, when he came to arrange financing for his homesteading venture. He painted such a vivid picture of the opportunities out west, the chance to build something from nothing." She trailed off, lost in memories. "And you followed him into the wilderness," Yates finished softly. "That took courage, or foolishness," Margaret replied with a sad smile. "Sometimes I'm not sure which." "Both, perhaps," Yates suggested. "The best decisions often require a measure of each." He hesitated, then asked, "Do you regret it, coming west?" Margaret considered the question carefully. "No," she said finally. Despite everything, no. Daniel and I had 3 good years together. We built something from nothing just as he dreamed, and I have my sons." She met Yates's gaze directly. "What about you, Mr. Jackson? Any regrets about your life choices?" A shadow passed across his features. "A few. Mostly things I didn't do, rather than things I did." He looked away, toward the window where snow continued to fall softly. "I sometimes wonder if I've focused too much on building this ranch and not enough on building a life." The vulnerability in his admission touched Margaret. This strong, capable man had his own regrets and uncertainties, just as she did. "It's not too late," she said gently. "For a life beyond the ranch, I mean." Yates's eyes returned to hers, something unreadable in their blue depths. "Perhaps not," he agreed quietly. A comfortable silence fell between them, broken only when Mrs. Garrett appeared at the door. "Begging your pardon, Mrs. Evans, but young Timothy seems to be wanting his mama." Margaret rose immediately. "Thank you for the company, Mr. Jackson." Yates stood as well, ever the gentleman. "The pleasure was mine, Mrs. Evans. Perhaps we could continue our conversation another time." "I'd like that," Margaret replied, surprised to realize how sincerely she meant it. As January melded into February, these evening conversations became a regular occurrence. After the twins were settled and the household quiet, Margaret would often find herself drawn to Yates's study. They spoke of books. He had an impressive library for a frontier rancher, of their respective childhoods, of their hopes for the territory's future. Carefully, they circled around more personal topics, neither quite ready to venture into those deeper waters. During the days, Margaret gradually took on more household responsibilities, finding satisfaction in productive work after months of mere survival. She discovered she had a talent for organization that complemented Mrs. Garrett's cooking skills, and together they transformed the ranch house's operation from efficient to exceptional. The ranch hands noticed the change, commenting appreciatively on the improved meals, the fresher linens, the overall sense of home that now permeated the place. Jim Perkins, never one to mince words, remarked to Yates one evening as they checked the horses, "Place feels different with Mrs. Evans here. Better." Yates merely nodded, but later that night, as he sat by the fire in his study, he reflected on the foreman's observation. The ranch did feel different, warmer somehow, more complete. The sound of children, even infants, brought life to rooms that had felt merely functional before. And Margaret herself. Yates found himself increasingly drawn to her quiet strength, her intelligence, her devotion to her sons. But she was a widow, still grieving. And their arrangement was temporary until spring, she'd said repeatedly. The thought of the house emptying again when she returned to her homestead left a hollow feeling in his chest that he wasn't ready to examine too closely. February brought a brief thaw that quickly refroze, coating everything in treacherous ice. Ranch work became particularly dangerous, with horses slipping and men falling despite precautions. Yates worked alongside his hands, setting an example of caution while ensuring essential tasks were completed. One afternoon, as Margaret stood at the kitchen window watching the men work in the freezing corrals, a shout of alarm caught her attention. One of the younger hands had fallen from the fence he was repairing, landing awkwardly on the icy ground. Yates was at his side instantly, helping the young man to his feet and supporting him toward the house. Margaret hurried to open the door as they approached. "What happened?" "Bill caught his boot and came down hard on his ankle," Yates explained, helping the grimacing young man inside. "Might be broken." "Bring him to the kitchen," Margaret directed. "Mrs. Garrett, could you fetch clean linens and the medical kit?" For the next hour, Margaret surprised everyone, including herself, with her calm efficiency in treating the injury. Her father's insistence that she learn basic medical care. No telling what you'll face out west, Margaret, he'd warned, proved invaluable as she determined the ankle was severely sprained but not broken. "You've got healing hands, Mrs. Evans," Bill said gratefully as she finished wrapping his ankle. "Don't know many ladies who wouldn't faint at the sight of such swelling." Margaret smiled as she secured the bandage. "I'm not most ladies, I suppose, and certainly not after everything I've experienced out here." Yates, who had been watching silently from the doorway, spoke up. "Bill, you're relieved of outdoor duties until that heals. You can help Mrs. Garrett and Mrs. Evans in the house." "Yes, sir," the young man replied, clearly relieved not to be docked wages during his recovery. Later, after Bill had been settled in the bunkhouse with his leg elevated, Yates found Margaret in the pantry organizing supplies. "That was impressive work today," he said. "Where did you learn such skills?" Margaret continued, counting jars of preserved vegetables. "My father insisted I learn before coming west, said proper medical help might be scarce." She paused, a sad smile touching her lips. "He was right about that, as he was about many things. The midwife who delivered the twins was the first medical professional I'd seen in nearly 2 years. Yates leaned against the doorframe, studying her. "You're a remarkable woman, Margaret Evans." It was the first time he'd used her given name, and the intimacy of it hung in the air between them. Margaret felt her cheeks warm as she met his gaze. "Necessity makes us remarkable, Mr. Jackson. You'd be surprised what you can do when there's no alternative." "Yates," he said quietly, "I think after all this time under the same roof you might call me Yates." Margaret nodded slowly. "Yates," she repeated, testing the name. "And I'm Margaret, though most called me Maggie before I came west." Daniel always preferred Margaret, said it was more dignified. "Margaret suits you," Yates said. "Strong, classic, but I can see Maggie too in your smile when you let it show." The moment stretched between them, something unspoken passing in the air. Then a cry from upstairs, one of the twins awakening from their nap, broke the spell. "I should go to them," Margaret said, moving toward the door. Yates stepped aside to let her pass, but as she drew level with him, he spoke again. "Margaret, I'm glad you're here, not just for Bill's sake today, but I'm glad you're here." The simple sincerity in his voice touched something in Margaret that had been dormant since Daniel's death. "I'm glad too," she whispered, then hurried upstairs to her sons. That night, as a fierce blizzard howled outside, Margaret sat by the fire in the main room, rocking gently as Timothy nursed. Thomas was already asleep in his cradle nearby. The house was quiet, the ranch hands having retired early in preparation for the difficult work that would follow the storm. Footsteps on the stairs announced Yates's approach. He paused when he saw her, clearly uncertain whether to enter or retreat. "Please don't go," Margaret said softly. "I'm nearly finished here and the company would be welcome. Storms always make me uneasy." Yates nodded and took a seat across from her, careful to give her privacy. He stared into the fire, seemingly lost in thought. "Penny for your thoughts," Margaret prompted as she gently moved Timothy to her shoulder to burp him. Yates looked up, a wry smile crossing his features. "Not worth that much, I'm afraid. Just thinking about spring preparations, calving season approaching, the usual ranch concerns." Margaret studied him, sensing there was more he wasn't saying. "And there's something else troubling you." Yates hesitated, then sighed. "You've said several times that you plan to return to your homestead in spring." "Yes," Margaret confirmed, though with less certainty than before. "That was our agreement." "It was," Yates acknowledged. He paused, choosing his words carefully. "I've been thinking about your situation. Your homestead is isolated, the land difficult to work alone, with 2 young children." He trailed off. You think I can't manage it, Margaret said, a hint of defensiveness creeping into her voice. I think you could manage anything you set your mind to, Yates corrected quickly. But I wonder if you should have to. He leaned forward, his expression earnest. There are other options, Margaret. Her heart beat faster at the intensity in his gaze. Such as, stay, he said simply. Not as a housekeeper, but as a partner. The ranch is profitable, growing. There's more than enough to support you and the twins, to give them a good life, education, opportunities. Margaret stared at him, trying to understand what he was proposing. A partner? In what sense? Yates stood abruptly and paced to the window, staring out at the swirling snow. When he turned back, his expression was resolute. I'm not expressing myself well. What I'm trying to say, Margaret, is that in these past months I've come to care for you, and for Timothy and Thomas. The thought of you leaving. He shook his head. I don't want you to go. Margaret felt as though the air had been pulled from her lungs. She looked down at Timothy, now sleeping peacefully against her shoulder, his tiny face so trusting. Yates, you don't need to answer now, he interrupted gently. I know it's sudden. I know you're still grieving Daniel. I just wanted you to know that there's a place for you here, for all of you if you want it, however you want it. He moved toward the door. Think about it. There's time before spring. After he left, Margaret sat motionless, her mind whirling with conflicting emotions. Gratitude, confusion, anxiety, and something else. Something warm and hopeful that she'd thought had died with Daniel. The realization both frightened and exhilarated her. As February gave way to March, the unspoken question hung between them. Yates didn't press for an answer, and Margaret couldn't bring herself to raise the subject. Instead, they continued their evening conversations, each growing more comfortable in the other's presence, learning the rhythms and nuances of each other's thoughts. The twins celebrated their 3-month milestone, growing more alert and responsive each day. Yates took particular delight in their developments, often sitting with Margaret as she tended to them, offering a finger for tiny hands to grasp, or a gentle voice that seemed to soothe even their fussiest moments. You're good with them, Margaret observed one evening as Yates carefully cradled Thomas while she fed Timothy. Have you had much experience with babies? A shadow crossed his features. No, not really. Had a younger sister once, but she died in infancy. I was only 5, but I remember holding her just once before the fever took her. I'm sorry, Margaret said softly. I didn't know. Yates shrugged slightly, careful not to disturb Thomas. It was a long time ago, but I remember how it changed my mother, the loss. She was never quite the same afterward. Margaret nodded, understanding all too well how grief could transform a person. And your parents now? Both gone, Yates replied. Father 5 years ago, as I mentioned. Mother 2 years before that. They built this place from nothing, just as you and Daniel did with your homestead. He looked down at Thomas, who was watching him with solemn eyes. Strange how life circles around, isn't it? Before Margaret could respond, a commotion outside drew their attention. Shouts and the sound of horses approaching at speed broke the evening quiet. Yates handed Thomas back to Margaret and moved quickly to the window. Riders coming in fast, he reported, his posture instantly alert. Stay here with the boys. He strode to the gun cabinet, removed his rifle, and headed for the door. Margaret's heart raced as memories of Daniel's last day flooded back. He'd left with similar haste, never to return. Yates, she called, unable to mask the fear in her voice. He turned at the door, understanding immediately. It's all right. Probably just one of the hands with urgent news. I'll be careful. Margaret nodded, clutching both twins close as Yates disappeared outside. She moved to the window, peering anxiously into the gathering dusk. 3 riders had entered the ranch yard, 2 of Yates's hands who'd been sent to town for supplies, and a third man Margaret didn't recognize. The stranger dismounted slowly, seemingly injured or exhausted. Yates approached cautiously, rifle ready but not aimed, and spoke with the men. After a moment, he lowered his weapon completely and helped the stranger toward the house. The door opened, and Yates called out, "Margaret, could you prepare the guest room and bring my medical kit? We have an injured visitor." Relief flooded her at the sound of his voice, followed immediately by concern for the stranger. She quickly placed the twins in their cradle and hurried to prepare as requested. The injured man turned out to be a cattle buyer from Kansas City, ambushed by thieves on his way to a neighboring ranch. He'd been shot in the arm and beaten, then left for dead until Yates's men found him on the road. Lucky your boys came along when they did. The man who introduced himself as Edward Simmons told Yates as Margaret cleaned and bandaged his wound. "Those thieves took everything, my money, papers, even my good boots. Rustlers have been getting bolder," Yates replied grimly. "Used to be they'd just take unbranded cattle, now they're attacking travelers too." He exchanged a significant look with Margaret, both thinking of Daniel's similar fate. "Well, I'm in your debt," Simmons said, wincing as Margaret tied off the bandage. "And in this lady's as well. You have gentle hands, madam. Mrs. Evans has many talents," Yates said with undisguised admiration. "We're fortunate to have her here." After settling their unexpected guest for the night, Margaret found Yates in his study, writing letters by lamplight. "What are you doing?" she asked, noting his grim expression. "Warning neighboring ranchers about the attack and writing to the territorial marshal." He looked up, his face shadowed with concern. "These aren't random incidents anymore, Margaret. There's an organized gang working this area, the same type who killed Daniel, I'd wager." Margaret sank into a chair, the reality of the frontier's dangers freshly apparent. "Will they come here?" Yates set down his pen. "We're better protected than most, more hands, good sightlines from the house, regular patrols, but I'm increasing security anyway. No one rides alone now and we'll post guards at night." Margaret nodded, then voiced the question that had been haunting her. "My homestead. If I were there alone with the boys, you'd be an easy target," Yates confirmed, not softening the truth. "Isolated, vulnerable, exactly the sort of place these men prey upon." The reality settled heavily on Margaret's shoulders. Her dream of returning to the home she'd built with Daniel seemed suddenly foolish, even dangerous. "I've been selfish," she whispered, "clinging to a memory at the risk of my children's safety." Yates moved to kneel beside her chair, taking her hands in his. "No, Margaret. You've been loyal to your husband's memory, to the life you built together. There's nothing selfish in that." Tears filled her eyes as she looked into his earnest face. "But I can't go back, can I? Not with things as they are, not with Timothy and Thomas to protect." "You have choices," Yates said gently. "You could sell the homestead, move to town. Muskogee is growing, you could find work there, be among people." Margaret shook her head. "And what kind of life would that be for the boys? Cramped rooms above a shop, perhaps. Days spent with strangers while I work for meager wages." She wiped away a tear. "Daniel wanted better for them, land, opportunity, a legacy." Yates hesitated, then spoke carefully. "There's another option, one I mentioned before." He took a deep breath. "Margaret, I know it's soon, perhaps too soon. But my feelings haven't changed. I care for you deeply. For the boys, too. Stay here not as my housekeeper, but as my wife." Margaret's breath caught. Though she'd suspected this was coming, hearing the words aloud made her heart race. "Yates, before you answer," he interrupted gently, "know that I don't expect you to forget Daniel. I know your heart still belongs partly to him and always will. I'm not asking for what you had with him. I'm offering partnership, security for you and the boys, and yes, affection as much as you're willing to accept." He squeezed her hands. "We could build something good here, Margaret, for all of us." Margaret looked into his earnest blue eyes and saw something that had been missing from her life since Daniel's death: hope. Not just survival, but the possibility of happiness. "The twins need a father," she said softly. "Someone to teach them, protect them. And you?" Yates asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "What do you need, Margaret?" The question struck her deeply. What did she need? For months, she'd thought only in terms of the twins' needs of basic survival. Her own heart's desires had seemed irrelevant in the face of such challenges. "I need." She hesitated, searching for honesty. "I need to feel safe again, to have a partner in this life, to know my boys will grow up secure and loved." She met his gaze directly. "I'm not sure if I'm ready to love again as a wife should, but I care for you, Yates." "More than I expected to care for anyone after Daniel." Yates nodded, understanding in his eyes. "That's enough for now. The rest can grow with time if it's meant to." He gently raised her hand to his lips, pressing a chaste kiss to her knuckles. "Will you marry me, Margaret Evans? Will you make this house a home for our family?" The word "our" resonated within her, a new family, built from broken pieces but no less valuable for the joining. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, I'll marry you, Yates Jackson." His face transformed with joy, years seeming to fall away in an instant. "You won't regret it, Margaret. I promise you'll never be alone again, you or the boys." The words echoed in Margaret's mind, the same words he'd first spoken at her cabin door months ago, though she hadn't recognized their deeper meaning then. Perhaps some part of him had known even then what might grow between them. Spring arrived early that year, bringing with it new beginnings in more ways than one. Margaret and Yates were married in a simple ceremony at the ranch, with Mrs. Garrett, the ranch hands, and a few neighbors as witnesses. The twins, now 4 months old, attended in Margaret's arms, uncomprehending but present for this new chapter in their lives. "They may not be mine by blood," Yates told Margaret the evening before their wedding, "but they'll be mine in every way that matters. I'll raise them as my own sons, teach them everything my father taught me, and more." "They're lucky to have you," Margaret replied, watching as he gently rocked Thomas to sleep. "We all are." Their wedding night was approached with tender consideration on both sides. Yates had prepared the master bedroom with fresh linens and wildflowers gathered from the emerging prairie. When Margaret came to him, nervous but resolute, he took her hands and spoke softly. "We have all the time in the world, Margaret. There's no rush for anything." But Margaret had made her decision. Daniel would always have a place in her heart, but her future and her body belonged to the present, to this good man who had saved her in more ways than one. "I want to be a true wife to you, Yates," she whispered, moving into his embrace. "In every way." Their coming together was gentle, unhurried, a discovery of each other that felt both new and somehow familiar. Afterward, as they lay together in the darkness, Margaret felt a peace she hadn't known in years, not the absence of grief, but its integration into a new wholeness. Spring melded into summer, and the ranch thrived under their joint care. Yates's business acumen combined with Margaret's organizational skills created a more efficient operation than ever before. The ranch hands, initially uncertain about their boss's new family situation, soon came to appreciate the stability and comfort Margaret brought to the place. Jim Perkins, always direct, summed it up one evening as they all shared dinner in the newly expanded dining room. "Boss, marrying Mrs. Evans was the smartest business decision you ever made. Place runs better, food's better, and you're not half as ornery as you used to be." Laughter erupted around the table, Yates joining in good-naturedly. "Can't argue with that assessment, Jim. Though I'd say it was my heart making the decision, not my business sense." Margaret blushed at the open affection in his voice, still adjusting to this public acknowledgement of their relationship. The twins, now 7 months old and sitting in specially built high chairs, banged enthusiastically on their trays as if in agreement. That night, after the twins were settled in their new nursery, a room adjacent to the master bedroom that Yates had renovated himself, Margaret joined her husband on the porch. They often ended their days this way, watching the sunset and sharing the day's events. "I rode by your old homestead today," Yates said, his arm around her shoulders. "The repairs are holding well. Henderson's boy is doing a good job working the land." After much discussion, they had decided not to sell Margaret's homestead, but to lease it to a neighboring family's son who wanted to start farming on his own. The arrangement provided income while preserving the property for Timothy and Thomas's future, a legacy from their birth father that Yates insisted on maintaining. "Thank you for that," Margaret said, leaning against him, "for understanding why it matters to keep it in the family." Yates nodded, his cheek resting against her hair. "They should know their history, where they came from, the man who gave them life. Daniel will always be part of their story, as he is part of yours." The generosity of spirit in this acknowledgement never failed to touch Margaret's heart. Many men would have wanted to erase a predecessor's memory, but Yates seemed to understand that the past shaped but did not diminish the present. "I have something to tell you," Margaret said after a comfortable silence had stretched between them. "Something important." Yates shifted to look at her, concern instantly crossing his features. "Is everything all right?" Margaret smiled, taking his hand and placing it gently over her abdomen. "More than all right. Dr. Matthews confirmed it today when he came to check on the twins. We're going to have a baby, Yates. In winter, late January, he thinks." Yates's expression transformed from concern to wonder to joy in rapid succession. "A baby, our baby," Margaret nodded, tears of happiness filling her eyes. "Our baby. The twins will have a little brother or sister." Yates pulled her into a gentle embrace, his own eyes suspiciously bright. "Margaret, I never thought, after all these years alone, to have this family, you, the boys, and now a new little one." His voice broke slightly. "I'm the luckiest man in the territory." "And I'm the luckiest woman," Margaret whispered against his chest. "A year ago, I thought my life was ending. I couldn't imagine a future without Daniel, couldn't see beyond grief and fear." She looked up into his beloved face. "But you showed me that life continues, that love can grow again in unexpected places." Yates cupped her cheek tenderly. "When I found you that day, alone with the twins in that cold cabin, something in me knew. I couldn't explain it then, but looking at you, at those tiny boys, I felt like I'd found the missing pieces of my life." He smiled, the expression crinkling the corners of his eyes. "Remember what I said to you that day?" Margaret nodded, the words etched in her memory. "You said I would never be alone again." "And you never will be," Yates promised, sealing the vow with a kiss as the last light of day painted the sky in shades of promise. In January of 1880, as a gentle snow fell across the prosperous Jackson ranch, Margaret gave birth to a healthy son they named William Daniel Jackson, a name honoring both their fathers while beginning a new legacy. The twins, now a year old and toddling energetically around the ranch house, regarded their new brother with fascinated curiosity under the watchful eyes of their proud parents. 3 sons. Yates marveled as he cradled the newborn while Margaret rested. From none to 3 in just over a year. "Life has a way of surprising us, doesn't it?" "The best kind of surprise," Margaret agreed, watching her family with contented exhaustion. Timothy and Thomas would grow up never remembering a time before Yates, never knowing the desperation of that lonely cabin. They would know only security, love, and the strength of a family forged through both loss and hope. As for Margaret herself, the young widow who had once faced the frontier's harsh realities, alone with newborn twins, she had discovered a resilience within herself she hadn't known existed. And in Yates Jackson, she had found not a replacement for what she'd lost, but a new beginning, a different kind of love no less profound for being unexpected. Outside, the snow continued to fall, covering the land in pristine white nature's way of showing that even after the harshest seasons, renewal always comes. Inside, in the warmth of the home they had built together, Margaret and Yates began another chapter in their unlikely love story, a story that had started with desperation, but would continue with joy, bound by a promise kept and a family made whole against the odds.